this is BioPhoenix here, and we're back again with my top 30 favorite games on each console, and this time we're talking about the Sega Genesis. I don't need to go into an introduction on this one, but I will say that I did not grow up with the Sega Genesis in its prime, but I eventually played one over the years, and I've played many games on different compilations and whatnot, and of course I just went out and explored many games in its library over time. And given that I'm making a whole video on this console, yeah, I definitely do like a lot of games on here. And let's go over the basic rules like I always have to, is that I'm only going to be naming one game per franchise. And I wouldn't take the order of this list too seriously. Just because I rank a game higher than another game doesn't mean I think it's 100% better than it in every way possible, because I try to include many different genres that I really like, and also there's a lot of games in here that are both well-known and on the obscure side. So just think of this as one giant ass recommendation list, and maybe you might have something new to play. Also, one other thing I do have to mention specifically about this one, I'm just sticking to the Genesis, so there's not going to be any Sega CD games or 32X games. As much as I like a lot of Sega CD games and, you know, the maybe like 4 games on the 32X, I didn't want to include them here. I felt like there was already enough stuff on the Genesis alone to talk about. So let's just get right to it. So for number 30, we have Vector Man, the first one to be exact. So the very first time I played this game was actually on the Sonic Gems collection. Yeah, they included it on there for some reason. Not that I minded, because I actually thought this was a pretty cool game. So the graphics in the game were very impressive for the Genesis. I do like the action in the game, and yeah, even though the main character is basically just a bunch of green balls put together, I don't know why, I kind of like the way he looks. I always thought he was just very unique looking. There's also a lot of good variety of different levels and different power-ups you can get on your character. And the game is very challenging, but very satisfying as well. I believe the farthest that I've been in this game was a part where you had to fight a giant dude in a tornado, and I remember it being insanely difficult, but outside of that though, I still found this to be a very enjoyable game, and I actually liked the first one a lot better than the second one. Not to say that the second game was bad, I mean, it pretty much plays exactly like the first one, but I felt like a lot of the levels weren't nearly as interesting or as memorable as the first game, because the first game had a lot of really interesting looking backgrounds and different bosses to fight. So yeah, it's a pretty tough game that I've always enjoyed. And as for number 29, we have Mazin Saga Mutant Fighter. Yeah, we got ourselves a game based after one of Go Nagai's works, being Mazin Saga, which is kind of like a cool mixture of like Mazinger Z and Devilman. Which the whole idea alone on that is fucking awesome. And the game happens to be a beat 'em up, which is always good by me. It controls pretty good, there's a lot of different cool moves that you can do. I really love the jumping attack where he like spins around with the blades, it's really awesome. You also get lots of cool different stages and a lot of cool enemies to fight. And once you reach to the end of the stage and fight the boss, then it turns into a fighting game, which is very interesting. And I have to admit, despite them looking really impressive looking, unfortunately, I do find that these boss parts are my least favorite parts of the game. Not only do I think the controls on them are not nearly as fluent as they are in the beat-em-up parts, but I also find that the bosses are just really insanely hard. Which is partly the reason why I don't put it on the same level as other beat-em-ups on the Genesis, but despite of that one thing though, I do find that the main stages themselves are very fun and well made, and I still like this game overall. It just has some flaws with the boss battles, but everything else about this game I do really like, and I still do have fun with it. And for number 28, we have... Alright, so I'm probably gonna butcher the name, but let me try. Magical Tarutu-kun. Well, I tried, but you see the title down below. So anyways, this is a game that is based after an anime and manga series that was in Shonen Jump, and it was in there for quite a while, so it was quite popular for a bit. I think it was even on the front cover of a couple issues too. But unfortunately, that's the extent of my knowledge on the original source material, because I'd never seen it or read it. But that's how I discovered it, was because of this game. And probably the most interesting part about this game for me is that this game was developed by Game Freak. Yeah, before they made Pokemon, they made a game on the Sega Genesis. And it's actually a pretty solid game too, so as you can see, it is a side-scrolling platformer where you run around, you pick up random objects and you throw them at people, and every time you pick up these objects, they have like eyeballs on them. If I can compare this to another game, it does sort of remind me of a Kirby game in some aspects, in the sense that they're both pretty chill and not so crazy fast-paced. And some of the objects that you pick up in this game do have special abilities to them, which does sort of remind me of Kirby whenever he eats someone, he gets special abilities out of it. And of course, they're both very cutesy looking and have a nice charm for them. But this guy doesn't fly in the same way how Kirby does in his game. Instead, he mostly glides, and I have to say the gliding ability is very handy in more ways than one, and they have utilized some really good level design with it too. So yeah, it's a pretty good chill platformer that I do enjoy. And as for number 27, we have Beyond Oasis. So this is a top-down action RPG, and it does remind me of Zelda in some aspects. I think a lot of them are pretty obvious, but there's a few things that are pretty different though. Firstly is the set piece in the game, is that it kind of takes place in a more Arabian setting, which I think is pretty different, and it does look pretty cool in this game. The game also has a jump button, which is something that Zelda didn't have for like many years unless you used a rock feather. And the way how the combat is formulated, I think is very different too, for that you do have a lot of different moves that you can do, and sometimes it almost does kind of feel like a beat 'em up. And that aspect of it really does change things up a lot. But as much as I do enjoy this game, I spent more time playing the game on Sega Saturn being Legend of Oasis, and because of that, I do remember a lot of things in that game a lot better than the one on the Genesis, but the Genesis game still provides a very interesting differences to the usual top-down Zelda-ish games. So I gotta give it a lot of credit for starting out with something so very different in the genre, and I do think it is a really cool game, and I do apologize that I didn't go like super in depth into this one, but I mean, you know, we still got a long way to go. And next up at number 26, we have High Seas Havoc. Now this is a game that I played for the first time somewhat recently, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. So you play as this like weird seal looking guy who looks like a pirate. You open up some treasure chests, you also bounce around on little drums, and the noise that they make is always amusing to me. And I have to say, the game's color palette is really nice in this game. I really love the way the graphics look in this one. It's very bright and colorful, you got a lot of very interesting looking enemies, and all the sprite work is really nice too. So as you might be able to tell, yeah, this does look very similar to a Sonic game, and yeah, the way how he runs does kind of remind me of one. But the way how they handle the level design is very different though, for that there's no loop-de-loops you gotta worry about. So while it may look like a Sonic game, it does play pretty differently, it just happens to have a little bit of speed to the game. Plus the way that you attack in the air is also very different than Sonic. But yeah, this is a pretty enjoyable platformer with a lot of very cool levels. I really like the music a lot too. There's a lot of good upbeat, catchy songs in the game. And I find it to be a pretty underrated game from the company Data East. So now let's get moving on to number 25, and that is Insector X. So this is the very first shoot 'em up that we're taking a look at on this list, and it certainly won't be the last. But yes, this is a very cool looking game, and one thing that is interesting about the Genesis version of this game is that the graphical style within the two versions of the Genesis and the arcade are totally different. So in the arcade version, your main character that you're playing as kind of looks like this very cutesy looking bumblebee guy with a hard hat. But in the Genesis version, they made him look like a cybernetic bug warrior. He actually looks really badass. In fact, I would actually say that the Genesis version is just a way more badass looking version of the game. And because of that, I actually prefer the Genesis version a lot more. But yeah, it's a pretty typical horizontal shooter, and it is actually a really fun one. It also has a good challenge to it too, but I will say that I do feel like this game does get pretty hard, mostly because of the fact that when you die in a level, it's hard to get back all those power-ups that you lost, and then you gotta fight the boss when you're at a huge disadvantage. But outside of that though, I do like everything else about the game. I do think it is a very enjoyable shoot 'em up, and yeah, there's a lot of other ones I gotta talk about here. But yeah, I can definitely say that this is a really good one that is also just really cool looking. And next up at number 24, we have Philios, and this one is a very unique looking shoot 'em up in many ways. For one, you're not a spaceship shooting shit in space. Instead, you're a guy on a Pegasus. And it's all about charging up your sword and shooting it at things. So that right there makes it stand out quite a bit, and it is actually a very fun game too. For that, I do think it also does provide a pretty decent challenge, and it still graphically looks pretty good for Genesis standards, even compared to the arcade version. And I just remembered that this is a game that I've reviewed on my channel like years ago. I haven't rewatched it, but I do remember I said a lot of good things about the game, and well, even after replaying it all these years later, I still think it's a really good one that has some really different stuff going on for it than the usual shit. And as for number 23, we have Mystic Defender, another game that I reviewed ages ago. But the cool thing about this one is that this one is based after an anime, and a very obscure anime called Spirit Warriors. And it's also a sequel to a game on the Master System called Spellcaster, which is pretty interesting in its own way. But yeah, this one is a side-scrolling action platformer where you have different types of like beam magic shots that you can take. And for a very early Genesis game in 1989, I gotta admit, this game does look graphically pretty good for a game released that early on the Genesis. But I also think that the art style helps that out a lot. And I always found that this was just a really badass looking game for that. It has a lot of cool set pieces, lots of cool monster designs. In fact, I always found this one kinda had a bit of a horror vibe to it, which I always dug. But I should also say that this one is also pretty damn tough, for that I do remember the lava stage in this game was a real bitch. But once you get the hang of the way how you're supposed to maneuver around everything, I do find it to be a pretty enjoyable game that is very fun and satisfying to beat some of those hard levels. And as for number 22, we have Twinkle Tail. Yeah, this may sound like a pretty goofy ass name for a game, but it's actually really good and a lot of fun. So this one is a Japan-only game that kind of reminds me of Pocky and Rocky. So it's a top-down shooter where you walk around as a witch and you shoot magic spells at people. And you collect different special magic powers, and you can even extend your life bar. So there is a little bit of RPG stuff in here, but obviously I'm not going to call this a full-fledged, like, action RPG or anything like that. But the fact that it does have different stuff like that, I do think is really cool. Has some really nice looking graphics for the Genesis. I like the art style a lot. Also, the game's music is pretty nice as well. I do dig it. But also, just like Pocky and Rocky, this game is not easy by any stretch. It's also hard as hell. But as the many times that I get my ass kicked by this game, I still go back to it pretty often because I still have a lot of fun with the game. And there are times where I do get better and farther through it. So if you do want a really challenging game with this sort of style, then this is the game to play. And for number 21, we have Road Rash. Yeah, I finally put a game from EA on this list, but you gotta remember, this is back in the day when they were actually a pretty decent company. So which Road Rash on the Genesis is my favorite? There's 3 of them, and I think they're all really good, and it's really hard for me to pick, because sometimes they do kind of blend together for me a little bit, but they are all very fun, so I think for this one, I'll just say that the Road Rash series on the Genesis as a whole, because it's just so hard for me to pick which one I like the most, and that really goes to show you how consistently good these games were. But yeah, I don't have a whole lot of crazy things to say about Road Rash. I mean, it's one of those games that's just so fun to just pick up and play, and you get to beat the crap out of other motorcyclists when you run by them, and if you fall off your bike, you have to run back and get it, which is pretty amusing. So yeah, you can't go wrong with either of these versions, and even compared to some of the CD-based consoles, yeah, some of those ones are better on a more technical aspect, but I still like going back to these ones for what they are, because I still think they do function quite well. Alright, and as for number 20, we have Arrow Flash. This is yet another shoot 'em up, and another one that I've always considered to be a favorite. So the main gimmick with this one is that your spaceship can transform into a mech, and depending on which form you're in, you have different types of like power-ups and different special abilities, which I think is really cool. Also, I really love the graphics and art direction in this game, especially during the intro cutscene. I think that shit just looks amazing. And as you would expect for a shoot 'em up, yeah, this one's a little tough, but it's not stupidly insane though. And I've always considered it to be a fairly underrated shoot 'em up on the console, because I feel like this one doesn't get talked about a whole lot compared to many others out there. But yeah, I still find this one to be a pretty damn good one. Alright, and as for number 19, we have Lightning Force, or should I say Thunder Force 4, because apparently people get mad at you for calling it Lightning Force for some reason. Well, those people need to get the stick out of their ass and realize that who the fuck cares, the game is fucking awesome. And I do think all the Thunder Force games on the Genesis are really good, and for the longest time, I used to say 3 was my favorite. But it wasn't until recently, after doing this video, when I was trying to try out all the different games I want to put on this list, I kind of thought to myself that, yeah, you know what, I actually do think the 4th one might actually be the best one, but the other ones are still damn good though. So firstly I have to mention is that I do find this is a very impressive looking game on the Genesis. Has a lot of nice bright colors, also the animation is great, and I also just love how like huge the levels are, like the fact that you can go like up and down past like the screen of what you can see. It just shows you how huge they are. And I also like how you can choose what order you want to do the levels in. I do think that's a very nice feature as well. But as good as all this is, though, I have to say, my favorite part about this game is the music. Man, the music in this game is just phenomenal, especially that one stage theme later in the game, the one that's called Metal Squad. Man, that is just like one of the best songs I ever heard out of a Genesis. It's so heavy metal as fuck, I love it. So just like I've said about all these other shoot 'em ups that I've been talking about here, really fun, but also really hard, but I still go back and play them, and I still enjoy the hell out of them. And as for number 18, we have Golden Axe 3. Yeah, so this is my Golden Axe representation, and I do think the third game is easily my favorite. And I will say, the first two Golden Axe games on the Genesis, I find those versions are not bad, but they are a little bit rough around the edges, but the third game is where I feel like they really nailed it the most. So the controls in this one I think are a huge improvement. For that I think they are much faster, and they just feel a lot better too. And I do like that this game has different pathways that you can take throughout the levels, making it have more replay value. And the new characters that they introduce in this one are really cool looking, and my favorite one happens to be the Panther guy. He does a lot of wrestling moves. It's fucking awesome. So yeah, this one you just can't go too much wrong with a good old classic beat 'em up that just really improved upon the other two, I think. And as for number 17, we have El Viento. Yeah, this is a game I've always found to be a very underrated game. In fact, I was actually able to complete this one a couple years ago, and I will say, this game was really fucking tough, but man, after when I beat that shit, I was like, damn, that was a really fun game. So you play as a girl named Annette, and you have the power of the wind. So your main weapon is you shoot boomerangs, and then you can also have some magic spells, and you get more of them throughout the game. And this is a game from Wolf Team, so you know that the music in it is going to be really cool sounding, and yeah, I really love this OST a lot. Also, the game's graphics and art I think are really good for a pretty early Genesis game, and there's a lot of cool set pieces that you get to go out through the game as well. But I do think that this is a game I probably do like a lot more than most people do, especially if it's your first time playing through the game, because even I will admit, the first time that I first played El Viento, I like really sucked at it, because that first boss in the tank, I thought was really hard for a first boss, and it definitely did trip me up a few times. But then the rest of the levels afterwards are not too bad, and then the final level I think is really hard because you have a lot of flying things that will never leave you the fuck alone. So yeah, the game is not the most beginner friendly, but if you do stick with it though, I do think it is a very enjoyable game with a lot of very cool style to it. And one last point I will make is that it is easily the best game out of this whole little trilogy of games, because yes, the first game was Ernest Evans, which really sucks. And then there's one on Sega CD called Annette Again, and I thought it was like not that bad at first, but it does have some rough spots that do make it pretty annoying to play. Hopefully that one will get some sort of improvement hack, but anyways, yeah, El Viento is the best out of it, and I still think it is a very good game once you get the hang of things. And as for number 16, we have Arcus Odyssey, yet another Wolf Team game. So this one is a top-down shooter, but with a fantasy setting where you control a character and you gotta go through a maze and collect items and other magic spells. It's a very fun game, and it is pretty easy to pick up and play, and I also do find that this game isn't crazy difficult. Of course, it does get hard later on, but I do find this game is a lot easier than El Viento. And I also think it's easier to Twinkle Tail, which is a much more similar game to this. And I also think it's nice that you can play this game with 2 players. And another thing I really like about the game too is that the music has this very dark and atmospheric vibe to it. I really like it a lot. So yeah, this is just another one of those games from Wolf Team that I feel like I don't hear a lot of people talk about it, but I do think it is a really damn good one. Alright, and at number 15, we have Rocket Knight Adventures. Yeah, now this is a great action platforming game with a very unique idea. But I have to say, the main character that you use, Sparkster, is really freaking random. So, he's a possum with knight armor with a rocket on his back. Like, if you didn't know anything about this game and you pictured that in your head, you'd be thinking, what the fuck is this? But somehow, in a lightning in a bottle, it worked, because the game ended up being really fun. So the game is very fast-paced, especially when you utilize the rocket in very fun ways. There's quite a lot of different variety of levels to go through. The graphics and animations are top notch, and of course, the game's music is just amazing as well. But then again, Konami always knew when to make great music, no matter what platform they were on. And I'll even go as far to say that this might even be my favorite Rock Knight game out of the whole series, which is really saying a lot, because out of the ones that I played, they're all really good, but this one is probably my favorite. And as for number 14, we have Burning Force. Now this is a game that I didn't know about for a very long time. I found out about it a couple years ago, and this game really took me by surprise. So to sum it up, this game is basically Space Harrier, but way better. Well, at least better than the Genesis versions anyways. But yeah, this one is just very addicting, very fun, and just really awesome looking. I really love the graphics in it. And I also have to say, the death animation I think is really like over the top and badass looking. Like when your ship blows up, your character does like a whole bunch of backflips in a row and then jumps into the next car. And the music is also very catchy as well, and there's almost no bad thing I can say about this game. This one, like I said, took me by surprise for that. I didn't know about it for so long, and it ended up being a huge favorite. So if you're like me and you just never heard of this game for some whatever reason, then I think you should check it out. And as for number 13, we have Castlevania Bloodlines. Now this is a really good Castlevania game. I wouldn't say it's my top favorite in the series overall, but I still think it is a really good one that is very fun and has a lot of really cool things going for it. Like the two different characters that you get to pick with two different playstyles, I think is a nice change. And Eric Lacard with his giant spear, I think is just really cool looking, and it's a very unique weapon to use in a Castlevania game, and also he does have his advantages that I do really like. Also, this game has some pretty cool set pieces that you don't see very often in a Castlevania game, such as going to Italy and Germany. I think those stages are really cool. And another thing I want to point out real quick is that I think it's really badass that this game did not tone down any of the violence. There's a lot more blood and gore in this one compared to some of the other Castlevania games on the Nintendo consoles, which I think is just really cool that they actually kept all that in. The only thing I will say about this game that I don't like as much is the fact that it has limited continues, but outside of that though, everything else about this game is pretty damn good, and I can definitely say I like it better than all the NES ones for sure. So yeah, I think it's a pretty strong entry in the Castlevania series, especially within the classic style. And for number 12, we have probably one of the most well-known games on the Genesis, and that being Sonic the Hedgehog. But which Sonic game am I gonna talk about right here? Well, I know this might be the most cliche pick, but I gotta pick Sonic 2. But I will go out and say that Sonic 3, there are some levels in that game that I do like a little bit better than some in Sonic 2, but overall, consistently, I like Sonic 2 the best. Now, there's not much I can say about the game that hasn't been repeated like a bajillion times, but the one thing I can say that is very different compared to how most people first got into the Sonic series is that the first time I played a Sonic game was actually on a PC, but it was not through emulation though. It was actually through a weird program called Real Arcade. So, Real Arcade was basically this, sort of like a launcher for video games, kind of like Steam, GOG, or Epic Game Store, but obviously this came out way before all that shit. So I guess you can say that the people behind Real Arcade, they were way ahead of the game on that part. So yeah, we had it on our computer in the year 2002, and I remember they had a few Sega Genesis games on there, and that including the Sonic games, and this was in the year 2002. And what's crazy is that, even though this was the year that the 6th generation consoles were like all released, I still thought that looking at this game for the first time in that year was still very mind-blowing, just to see all the nice bright colors, the catchy music, how fast the game went. And it's funny because Sonic the Hedgehog 1 was 11 years old at that time, so it's just kind of funny to think back that, yeah, a game that was already 10 years old at the time looked just as impressive as the launch lineups for the GameCube, which I was like super excited to get at the time. So yeah, kind of a weird and funny yet unconventional way to get into the Sonic series, and of course before that I used to watch the Sonic Underground show and didn't even realize it was based after a video game. So there, that's probably the most, like, different thing I can say about Sonic 2 that most people probably haven't said. But yeah, let's just get moving on because we already know the game is fun. And for number 11, we have Crusade of Senti. And this is a game that I beat for the first time last year, so this one is still very recent memory for me, and I talked all about it in my games I beat of 2022, so I won't get too heavy into it here. But as you can tell that it's in here, yeah, I thought it was great. It probably is my favorite top-down Zelda-like game on the Genesis, and it has a lot of charm and some really good-ass music, so yeah, I don't really need to say much about it here since I've talked about it fairly recently, but yeah, it's one I can definitely recommend if you do like this sort of style. And alright, now we're in the top 10. So, as for the 10th spot, we have Shining Force 2. Now, I haven't really played much tactical RPGs on the Genesis, but out of the 3 that I played was Shining Force 2, Warsong, which is technically Langrisser, and then there was Gemfire, which is a Koei game. And out of the 3, this is the one that hooked me in the most, but I do want to go out and say that Langrisser did seem like a really cool game, and I think I would like it a lot, I just didn't put a crazy amount of time into it. But I suppose I could just honorable mention and say that, yeah, it's also a pretty cool game. But Shining Force 2, though, yeah, this one is just really great. And interesting enough, I do find that Shining Force 2 does have a couple aspects that reminds me of the Growlancer series that came later, because this one also has the tactical strategy battles, but when it comes to navigation, it plays like a traditional RPG. I know I always like that mixture of style. So yeah, this one also has a really cool art style. In fact, I really love the battle animations in this game. I think they're pretty cool looking. And I do remember this game being pretty accessible for a tactical strategy RPG. It's not overwhelming, and it also isn't like bullshit hard. Unless you're playing on the hardest difficulty, which makes sense, but yeah, the fact that this game does have multiple difficulties is always a good thing. But it is pretty interesting that the Shining series has been through so much drastic changes. Like, it started from a first-person dungeon crawler, then it went to a strategy RPG, and then it moved on to a 3D action RPG. And out of the few Shining Force games, or Shining-related games that I've played, this one is one of my favorites. Alright, and as for number 9, we have Gaia Rays, which I believe that's how it's said. I've heard a couple people say it differently, but fuck it, you know the game, it's a freaking shoot 'em up. And it's a pretty great one at that, so yes. This one is really fun, has a lot of really cool power-ups, like the graphics a lot, the music is great. The game is pretty difficult, but it's one of those games that, despite how much times I die on certain parts, I still always go back to it. But the one thing that does set this game differently that I do really like is that it has like a little orb that you can absorb certain weapons, which sort of does remind me of the game Zero Wing, which most people know about for the freaking all your base meme, which is in itself is pretty amusing, and also I will go out and say, that's also a damn good game that I easily could have put on here as well. But Gaia Rays is the one that I tend to go back to pretty often when I'm in the mood for some shoot 'em ups on the Genesis. Alright, and as for number 8, we have Phantasy Star 4. Yeah, it's not really much of a question, but yeah, Phantasy Star 4 is easily the best one out of the 4 games, or the 3 out of the Genesis ones. And the very first time that I played a Phantasy Star game was the second one through that thing that I talked about with Sonic 2, the real arcade little application there. Yeah, they had that game. But I don't remember if they ever put 3 or 4 on there, at least not that I can remember. But anyways though, this one took me a while on getting around to, and I gotta say, this game is pretty damn great. Even though I still never finished the game, I already know that this is already a top contender Genesis game just from what I've played of it. The graphics and art style is the best, even though I've already liked them a lot in 2, but this one takes it to a whole other level, and I especially love the way how they did the cutscenes with the comic book style, kinda makes it look like a colored manga, really love that a lot. The music is also just the best in the series as well. And the dungeon design is not a pain in the ass like the second game, which that makes me really happy. So yeah, this is one I definitely should try to actually finish through someday, but like I said, even with just what I've played, it was already a huge improvement that I found to be very impressive, and definitely one of the best RPGs on the system for sure. And as for number 7, we have Musha. Yeah, this game that everyone hypes up because of the damn prices. And yeah, it is unfortunate that this is a very expensive game, but, you know, if you do have a way to play it for free, which I feel like most people should at this point, I can already tell you that this is a really badass game. I mean, it's a freaking shoot 'em up with samurai mechs. How could you go wrong with that? and the graphics are amazingly well detailed for the system, very impressive, and the cutscene graphics look really awesome, and they remind me of a PC-98 game, which is saying a lot. The music is really hype, and the difficulty is not that bad for this game. Now sure, I wouldn't clarify it as an easy game, but I do think it is a lot easier and accessible compared to like Gaia Rays and Thunder Force 4 for an example. But that could also just be me playing a lot more of this style of shoot 'em up being top-down. But yes, overall, great game that I can't say enough good things about. And as for number 6, we have Valis 3. Yeah, some of my longtime viewers were probably expecting me to put this one pretty high, because I always really loved this series a lot. I always thought it was a very underrated platforming series in general. But out of the 3 Genesis games, the third one is easily my favorite. And there's even some aspects about the third game that I like even better than the PC Engine CD version, such as the button layout makes more sense with the Genesis version, and the Genesis version even has an exclusive level that is not in the PC Engine version. But both versions of the game are both very good, and they both have like great graphics and great music that represent their console counterparts. So yeah, this one is very fun for that you get to play as different characters. You get to level up your sword meter, which makes your attack stronger, and a lot of the places that you go to and the enemies you get to fight are very psychedelic looking, and I really like that a lot. And this game is pretty much like a Castlevania game in many aspects, and I really like it a lot. But also just like Castlevania, the game's also pretty difficult, but I still manage to have a great time with it regardless when I'm getting my ass kicked or not. But yeah, I'll just leave it at that, because this is a series I do talk about pretty often, so yeah, let's get moving on and start talking about number 5, and that happens to be Battlemania Daijinjo. So this is the sequel to the game Troubleshooter, but this one was Japan only. And man, this game is just great. Definitely one of my all-time favorite shoot 'em ups on the console for sure. So this one, as you can tell, has a lot of different things going on. For one, you're using characters who happen to be bounty hunters on jetpacks shooting at a bunch of shit. It kinda reminds me of the game Forgotten Worlds, but I like this one so much better. And you get to go to a lot of cool different places throughout this cybernetic world. It looks really great. In fact, the graphics in general are just really nice looking in this game. Lots of really cool enemies, lots of cool backgrounds, the character sprites are really nicely done. And the music is super heavy metal sounding, and I like it just as much as the one in Thunder Force 4. And also, like I said about Musha, this game is also not crazy bullshit hard, unless you're playing on the hardest difficulty, obviously, but if you're playing it on easy or normal, I actually don't think it's too badly difficult. So yeah, this is another all-time favorite shoot 'em up, and I feel like this one doesn't get talked about a lot. Probably due to it being Japan only, but man, at least nowadays, we can play it with ease. And as for number 4, we have Monster World 4. Now this is an awesome action platformer on the Genesis that I really love a whole lot. And there's also a remake version on modern consoles, and I do have that version, but I haven't gotten around to trying it out yet, which is kind of a shame given how much I love this game on the Genesis. Actually, the first time I played this game wasn't even on the Genesis at all, it was actually on PS3's PSN. So yeah, it's an action platformer with some light RPG elements, and you just gotta explore around different areas, you talk to people, and you gotta get items and all this kind of fun stuff. Sorta similar to a Zelda game, but in side-scrolling view. And I also find that this game does have a couple things in common with the Shantae games. For one, they both have a fantasy Arabian setting, and two, they both have a very similar gameplay style, but only that this one you're not killing people with your hair. But yeah, like I've been saying like a whole bunch of times about all these different games I've been talking about here, has some really beautiful graphics, great animation, some really nice cheerful music. And the game also just has a lot of charm, too. It's just one of those games that I just think is just really damn good, and I don't have anything negative to say about it. So now let's get moving on to the top 3. So, in third, we have Glaylancer, and this is the final shoot 'em up I'll be talking about in this video. But I also wonder if anyone's going to complain to the fact that I didn't call it by its full name, which is called Advanced Buster Hawk Glaylancer. Granted, that's a cool as fuck name, but do you really expect me to call it that every time I talk about the game, though? Yeah, it's a little long, so yeah, we'll just call it Glaylancer. And besides, I mean, this game is just amazing. Definitely one of my all-time favorite shoot 'em ups for sure. So as again, the graphics are great, the music is just phenomenal. In fact, I even mentioned this in my favorite OSTs on the Genesis that don't get enough love. And this one, yeah, this one is just like fantastic. Also, another interesting thing about this game is that there's actually two different endings that you can get, which is kind of interesting for a shoot 'em up to have. But yeah, it's just like every other shoot 'em up I've been hyping up here. I mean, do you want me to repeat everything? Just really fun. It's not extremely bullshit hard, and the presentation is just top notch. And if you're a fan of shoot 'em ups and you for some reason never played this game, I think you really should give it a try. It's just really good as shit. And yeah, I know I'm kind of rushing through things here, I do apologize for that, but I mean, we gotta talk about 30 games here. So let's get moving on to number 2, and that is Shinobi 3. Definitely one of my all-time favorite ninja games right here, with so much badass shit going on. Like, some of the bosses you get to fight are just very menacing looking and are just really rad, and then you got a lot of really awesome ideas for levels, like the part where you get to ride on a horse, and then my favorite one is the one where you get to go surfing. The music is also some of the best stuff you'll ever hear out of the Genesis, so many great catchy tunes, and the music for the surfing level is an absolute banger. And another thing I have to say about Shinobi 3 as well is that I also just really like the way how they handled the controls as well. I do think it's such a big improvement over Revenge of Shinobi, which that game is pretty cool, but I feel like this game just improved upon that so much more. Now sure, Revenge of Shinobi has like the really cool cameos on certain versions of the carts, like you got some bosses that are like Batman, Spider-Man, and Godzilla and all that, which yeah, that's pretty cool and all, but I feel like this game, like as a game, it's just more consistently better and a huge improvement. And because of this game right here, is the reason why I would consider the Shinobi series to be one of my favorites from Sega. Alright, now before we get to the number 1 spot, which I'm sure some people probably already know what it is at this point that know me well enough, let's get into some honorable mentions. And as always, I can't mention everything, cause, you know, obviously there is way more than 30 games on a system, and I don't want to mention the entire damn library because that would take forever, so yeah, let's not waste time and just get right to it. So we have Elisa Dragoon, Battle Golfer Yui, Zero Wing since I mentioned it earlier, Castle of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse, Gargoyles based after the cartoon, Mutant League Football and Hockey, The Punisher, though the arcade version's better, but the Genesis version's pretty decent for what it is, the Genesis version of Shadowrun, and finally I'll mention is Herzog Zwei, which is that little strategy RTS kind of game that you can play with 2 players. That game's actually really cool too. Alright, without further ado, let's take a look at number 1 spot, and that is Streets of Rage 2. Yeah, this is no surprise for anyone that's followed me long enough, because quite a while ago, I did a video response I got tagged in where I had to do my top 10 favorite games of all time, which is almost impossible to do, but I guess even what I'm doing now is almost impossible as well. This is really hard shit. So knowing all that, you kinda had to expect that it was gonna make it into this video somehow. So let's talk about how I first played this game, was that it was in the year 2004, and I played it at a friend's house who actually had a Sega Genesis. It was actually the very first time I ever seen a Sega Genesis in person before, believe it or not. And he had 4 games. He had Sonic the Hedgehog 1, Mortal Kombat, some stupid baseball game that I don't remember the name of. I remember we played it once and then never touched it again. And then this game. And this was the one game that I had no idea what it was, because I played Mortal Kombat before on the Super Nintendo, and Sonic the Hedgehog 1, like I said, I played on that real arcade thing, and then I also played it on the Sonic Mega Collection on the GameCube, which I happened to get that year. So I had no idea what Streets of Rage was at the time, so I thought it was going to be a fighting game, and when I played it, I was hooked. Like, I could not get enough of it. It was just so much fun, so satisfying to beat the shit out of everyone. It's pretty much the quintessential beat 'em up if you just want to just play a game, sit down, don't think about anything, just tear up everything in sight with some kick-ass music and some great graphics. Like, I don't know what else I can say about it that hasn't been said before, but I know there are some people that love the first game better, but for me, I love the second one better, but that probably just because of the fact it was the first one that I ever played. But the first game is not far behind in quality though, because that one is still really great, and I especially love the whole special ability where the guy comes out of the car and shoots a rocket launcher. That is the one thing I will give an edge to the first game, but outside of that though, I love everything consistently more about the second one. And as for the third one, if you're playing the Japanese version, it's pretty good, but I don't think it's as memorable as the first or second one. But the North American version was beyond butchered for some reason, so yeah, anyways though, the first 2, you definitely can't go wrong with, but for me, 2 holds a special place in my heart as being my all-time favorite Sega Genesis game. And there we have it. That is my top 30 favorite Sega Genesis recommendations, and as always, there's like a bajillion other ones I didn't mention here, but feel free to give out some of your favorites that you've played on the Genesis. And before we end it here, I will give out a hint on what my next one will be. And I'm sure most of you are thinking it's going to be the Super Nintendo, and I would like to do that one next, but I think I'm going to do the PC Engine one next, and the reason why is that there are two games on the Super Nintendo that I would really like to play more of, and I would like to mention them in my top 30 if I do like them enough, but the problem is, they're pretty long games, so it might be a while before we get to that one. Or at the PC Engine, I think I already have a good idea on which ones I want to mention, and thankfully most of the ones that I haven't played a whole lot of are not extremely long, so I'm going to do that one next. And then maybe after the PC Engine I'll do Super Nintendo. So there you go, that will be the plan from here on out. So it might be a little bit. So that'll be it for this video. So as always, thank you for watching and commenting, and have yourselves a great day.